Okay, so this is our project 2 that we're going to do for the denture clinic students next door. The first thing I would do, obviously, is read the prescription. We know this is going to be a lingual apron. We could use just a strengthening bar, but to make it easier for you guys, I would use the lingual bar with the inferior border at the top. The inferior border meaning the tapered border at the top, if I draw a cross section of it here to the side. So the tapered section goes to the occlusal. I'm going to put this in location as I would if it was just a regular lingual bar, which would be about 3 to 5 millimeters below the gingival margin. So the first thing I would do is I would put the lingual bar in place, just like if I was going to do it as a lingual bar major connector case. Roughly 3 to 5 millimeter space. Now this is an apron for possibly 2 reasons. There's not enough room sublingually due to some anatomical considerations like a lingual frenum or tori, or the client wants to increase indirect retention in this class 1 free end. Once I put the bar in place, I'm going to use some of the excess wax from the bar and seal it down on the inferior side and the superior side. Either way, whichever one first, underneath, on top. If I choose not to seal this, I run the risk of having investment go underneath the bar and making slight imperfections underneath my metal framework major connector. And those imperfections will look like erosion of a stream. I will take my alcohol torch, smooth out the lingual bar. It's not a lingual bar anymore. I'm just using it as wax bulk to start off my apron. You could use freehand wax. I'm going to use a bit of the bar to creep the wax up and maybe possibly add some freehand wax to get to the gingival margin. The gingival margin of all the anterior teeth. If you have any wax on your natural teeth during your blockout, I think it's heir apparent that that will create a space between your major connector and the framework. Excuse me, major connector and the natural teeth. So as you can see, I'm freehand waxing the mesoocclusal rest of 3-4, 4-4. I'm also freehand waxing just up into the prepared rests of 3-3 and 4-3. If I choose not to fill these rests in, there's no way that I could manage to achieve the same thickness if I use the stippled sheet. So, this would be step 1, I would say. Major connector. I'll get my alcohol torch and try to smooth it off. Try to be as neat as possible. This is really detailed work. If we end up with too much wax in one place, then we've got some inequities in thickness of the major connector. So this would be step one. I haven't refined my wax up on the lingual margins of the teeth, but I have gently added some wax up into the gingival third, roughly up into the cingulum or the gingival third of the natural teeth, and slightly on the guide plane. Step two, I would take my mesh retention. Now, very important here, I would add it to the length, but probably more prudent to be slightly above the length of my lingual bar. So if this is the furthest extremity of my lingual bar, the mesh retention will be just slightly above it. Just slightly above it. The mesh retention is trimmed over the crest of the ridge to allow room for the prosthetic teeth to be trimmed and maintain their gingival length on the buccal side. And I'll do the other side. When you're using the mesh retention, there's a pattern side and a smooth side. I think it would look better with the smooth side down. And then trim the mesh retention to the extension of my blockout, which is roughly distal of 6, exactly to the length of the blockout. And again on the left side here to the crest of the ridge. If I leave it a little bit longer, that'll just mean I'll have more to trim in chrome. So before I add anything else, I'll show you from this angle that the mesh retention is slightly higher than the bar and at a straight line. These mesh retention grids are going to be enveloped in acrylic with the teeth on top. If I make them too small, they're not strong enough to hold the natural teeth, prosthetic teeth. If I make them too big, then I run the risk of them being exposed outside of the free end. I reduce the amount of adjustment room that the practitioner has to achieve the patient, comfort. I've added these blue lines either equal to the lingual bar or slightly above the lingual bar. This is a 22 gauge wax. What is this for, is the question. This is to add strength to the retention grid, as well as provide a channel for molten metal when we're casting. A third reason would be to maybe protect my fingers when I'm holding it, trimming it. It's kind of a weak reason. I'm filling in roughly a row to a row and a half, or at least minimum half a row of circles on both sides. If you've dropped any waxes that I've done, I can remove it. Now I'm not using inlay wax, I'm using the wax pattern wax. I think it makes for a cleaner burnout that if all the wax that we're using is the same. Sometimes in the other waxes that leaves a residue in the burnout. So I've created almost like a triangle of wax up to the guide plane. Now there's many other ways to do this, but I think this would probably be the most acceptable way that you see in industry, that they would systematically do this wax up. So the major connector, then the mesh retention. I've added at the end of my blockout the tissue stops. These tissue stops are hanging off the end of my blockout. They'll be touching the tissue. And we talked about the purpose of those. To achieve a positive seat, to ensure that it gives us kind of like a visual check that the casting didn't move during processing. If you could think of these as kickstands on your bicycle, holding the bicycle up when it's on its side. So, the next step is the direct retainers. You can choose between a multitude of wax profile patterns. Here are some bicuspids molars, and here's a Christmas tree of patterns. You could use them for eye bars or regular acres G-clasps. I'm going to take a molar one to maintain the thickness of it, especially for students, because I know that you may get a little extra exuberant with the trimming or the deplating, and I'll surgerize the end of the tip off. I've located this one right on top of my ledge, the ledge that I've done to maintain 0.25 millimeters undercut on the mesial buckle. I'm going to seal it at the guide plane, probably the thickness of the clasp. If I thin this guide plane out too much here, I run the risk of the clasp breaking off. You don't want that to happen. I'm almost done. We're going to add the buckle arm of the G clasp on the right side. Now, it's really important not to get any fingernails, spatulas, hot spatulas, or drops of wax on the profile. Maintaining the integrity of the profile would achieve it a lot easier to get a product at the end. You don't want to deform the profile of wax. The third step is I'm going to add the 22 gauge wax and use it as an external finishing line. The internal finishing line is created by the block out, which I have below. This external finishing line should start exactly at the guide plane or the proximal surface of 4-4 that I'm explaining here or illustrating, and then straight down with a slight distal angle. You see the other sample I did up here? Is the other sample local here? You can pass that around if you need a closer look to see what I'm doing with this one. There we go. I'm going to seal the mesial side of the 22 gauge wax without overheating it to deform the height of the wax or the thickness. So I'm creating an undercut, almost like a ledge here, where acrylic now will butt up against this external finishing line. And you can see that I've extended it below the lingual bar. And if I take a pencil, this will be my area where acrylic, roughly at this point, will be the furthest lingual extension of the acrylic flange of the free end.
Oh, there we go.
And I can shorten it if I need be. I'll do the same on the other side. I was explaining to one of the students just recently that this external finishing line can be placed after the stippled pattern, but that would increase the polished borders. Just more time to finish. It comes down to personal preference. We will do both here. So as you can see, I was very careful not to ruin the integrity of the profile of the 22 gauge wax. I can take my alcohol torch, smooth it out. Don't obliterate the 22 gauge wax with the alcohol torch. Be very careful. And blend it into the major connector. The last step is I will take my stipple pattern. The stippled pattern has two sides. One side stippled, depending on the 6 or 7 varieties of stippling, and the smooth side on the other side. If we look at the natural teeth, there is no stippling behind our natural teeth. Although in dental laboratory procedures, we put stippling, this kind of aids in speed of the framework, gives it a rough surface, as well as, probably the worst reason, hides any porosity from the casting process, the stippling. Can kind of detract our eye away, kind of very poor. But obviously a rougher surface aids in the glutation of food to give a rough surface. If you would think of it as a roughened surface of tile on the floor, anti-slip. If you overstretch the stippled pattern, you will take out the stippled texture. I'm going to adhere it to the model and slightly cut above the wax cingulum that I have with my surgical knife. It's going to be about 0.3 millimeters at the superior border, and this is very difficult to cut the stippling line, 22 gauge wax and the stippled wax at the same time. Underneath the lingual bar, I will also trim it to exactly the length of the lingual bar. And the last step is to seal the major connector. If there's any point or area that doesn't have the major connector sealed at any of the borders, you run the risk of having investment go underneath. And if investment goes underneath, it can pull the pattern away, increasing the thickness or creating a lot of porosity underneath. Very carefully, just the border seal all the way around. Take this time to re-evaluate the thickness of the mesial-occlusal rests. I'll add some there. Seal the lingual reciprocation of this apron all the way around. And underneath. The finishing line was sealed from the heat of my surgical knife when I cut it. They are sealed together. I'm not adding any wax here. I'm just using the thickness of the stippled pattern wax to seal underneath. As you can see from some of the debris on my fingers, I've got a little bit of wax here that I'm taking off. Now, at this stage here, no alcohol torch. You run the risk of ruining the stippled pattern that you so tried to maintain its integrity. I can now refine my wax up. I could use my Zale carver. I can use the Zale carver, magnification if I choose, and go around ever so slightly and reevaluate my extensions. It's a lot easier to trim the partial denture in wax, leaving slightly overhang extensions for polishing, deplating, the acid etching process, the pre-polishing, concaving the rests, and really demarcating the lingual height of my apron all the way around, as well as the inferior border of my major connector. It's a lot easier to do this at this stage. Beautiful. Now, I'm anticipating you would spend more time cleaning up the wax up at this stage, that you would take some magnification and go ever so slightly with your Zale carver, any overhangs, reshape, but at no time take the alcohol torch out at this time. We run the risk of ruining the integrity of our stippled pattern. The last stage would be to sprue the major connection. Now I've increased the triangle of wax filling in the circles of the free end. This creates strength for the free end as well as a passage of molten metal. There's many solutions, if you want to call them, on spruing. If you're using a centrifuge or if you're using induction casting or pressure induction casting. But for this case, I think it'd be easier for the beginner to sprue just in front of the major connector external finishing line and below the mesh retention. I'm spruing below because it's easier to cut off at the end once we have our casted piece. The sprue must not be at right angles. As you can see, mine is gently turning into the framework underneath the retention. Join the two sprues together. surgerize the height of the sprues above the occlusal table. The sprue cannot be below the height of the wax pattern. So I'm holding at this angle so you can see that with a hot surgical blade, surgerize the top of the sprues, and now introduce my sprue former in this location. I can use a little bit of leftover stippling wax, base plate wax, to kind of help myself in attaching the sprue to the sprue former. Be really careful at this stage not to drop any wax on your pattern that you so painfully have carved. This is never a safe moment really in the wax up where you can damage all the hard work that you've done. Smooth the joint between the sprue former and the sprues themselves. If you have any sharp edges here, you run the risk of having the metal go inside, taking a piece of the investment off, and that traveling into your framework. If there's any sharp fins or edges of investment. So I'm going to join the two together. At this stage, I'm done. So I'm anticipating that we finish this today, and I think we all know the next step of sealing it in our investment ring and proceeding to casting.